Hello, my name is Isha Sarah Snow, and I am the author of Autism in America: One Woman's Search for Healing. This slideshow briefly explains the premise behind my book. My book is both a personal journey and a sociological critique. Autism makes more sense when we view it not as a defect but as a reflection of the relational and cultural forces around us. This project grew out of my lived experience as an autistic woman, trying to understand why my body reacted so intensely to the world and what that reveals about the society that we currently live in. Autism exists at the intersection of biology, trauma, and culture. My work brings together neuroscience, anthropology, sociology, and personal narrative to show that autistic traits often reflect the emotional conditions of a person's environment. By approaching autism through a relational and trauma-informed lens, we discover that the problem is not within autistic individuals, but within the systems they inhabit. Critical medical anthropology shows that autism is shaped as much by social power as by biology. The deficit model reflects the values of a culture obsessed with productivity and conformity rather than connection. When we examine autism through CMA, we see that what is often labeled a disorder is frequently the nervous system adapting to societal dysfunction. My work here expands on the work of other biocultural anthropologists who explore the impact that our environment has on our overall health and well-being. However, my work is unique in that it positions autism as a unique and valid standpoint to explore the social norms within a culture from. Autism cannot be captured by just one discipline of study. My integrated model links the nervous system with trauma, culture, and social structure, showing how autistic traits emerge where sensitivity meets fragmentation. Autism is the product of both internal biology and external relational forces interacting in complex ways. The vagus nerve is the body's social safety system, and its functioning reflects the emotional climate around us. When societies become more authoritarian, disconnected, or stressful, sensitive nervous systems react more strongly. Autism shows us how social environments shape physiology and why safety and connection matter so deeply. In the next 3 slides, I'm going to explore briefly a bit of autistic biology, and I would like you to please pay attention to any patterns you might see in the bolded and underlined words. Autism shows us how gut health influences social behavior, emotion, and cognition. Conditions like dysbiosis, leaky gut, and infections such as Toxoplasma gondii can also reveal how inflammation can affect the vagus nerve and the brain. These biological patterns mirror larger social stresses, showing that the body carries the imprint of environmental instability. Glial cells respond to stress, inflammation, and emotional environments, influencing how the brain learns and connects. When environments are chaotic or unsafe, glial cells stay activated, shaping sensory processing and emotional regulation. Their behavior reflects the quality of relational and social conditions. Autistic brains retain more synapses, creating dense networks that are excellent for pattern recognition, but vulnerable to overload in chaotic environments. This is not a biological flaw or random, it's an adaptation and a reaction to the exterior environment. Because when the world is unpredictable, the brain ends up holding on to extra connections to try and make sense of it. These images show how autistic neurons retain more synapses. Not only do autistic brains have an overabundance of synapses, but they also have more mirror neurons, which support empathy, attunement, and understanding others. When relational environments lack consistency or emotional safety, mirror systems adapt differently. Autistic mirroring often reflects the emotional patterns of the environments that people grow up in, and it doesn't indicate a lack of their own empathy, rather an overabundance of it. An overabundance of mirror neurons combined with the ways that mirror systems adapt differently exposes the hidden emotional conditions in our culture. Rising rates of autism prevalence reflect autistic overwhelm, sensory sensitivity, and distress in response to the environment. The rising social disconnection and chronic stress in America is being reflected in autistic bodies. In this manner, autistic people reveal the truths that society tries not to see about itself. Autism, because it is a condition that is primarily distinguished as having social deficits, can act as a cultural mirror exposing the cracks in our culture socially through their overstimulation, disconnection, inequalities, and chronic stress experienced. The rise in autism tells us more about society than about autistic individuals themselves. Autistic people, in this manner, show the emotional truth that cultures try to hide. Just like trees in a forest interact with mycelium from mushrooms in an interdependent ecology, human beings have a social and relational component to their ecology. I've compiled a list of the different items that go into making this social ecology, and for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to focus primarily on identity and linguistics, because language shapes reality. Language shapes how we see ourselves and each other. The Sapir-Whorf theory taught us that the words that we're born into understanding literally program our brain and change the way that we see the world. What's interesting is when we look at autism through a lens of settler colonial history, because we can see that the English language is specifically structured with the subject first to create an egoic structure or separate an understanding of I from the rest of the universe. If we contrast that with indigenous languages and cultures, they spoke and thought relationally. Everything was defined in terms of other things. It was very interdependent. So in a very real sense, we can see that autism is actually an allergy to the English language. It's a biological response to that false identity that is being placed by colonialism. Communities and entire nations can have nervous systems just like individuals do. So when society becomes more chaotic or anxious, polarized, feeling unsafe, That dysregulation shows up first in the most highly sensitive people. Autism, therefore, is our first line of defense. They become the canary in the coal mine, alerting us as a signal that the collective environment is out of balance. The act of colonizing breaks down a larger whole into smaller parts, and in so doing it creates false hierarchies of understanding. But when we remove that, we then replace it with our relational understanding, which is systemic. We realize that everything is interdependent with parts that interact with each other. Nothing occurs in isolation. We can then see that relational harm always scales into systemic harm. The issues that autistic people face, like misattunement, invalidation, coercion, are mirroring the larger conflicts and inequalities in society, in our policy, in our government. Healing relationships individually becomes our pathway to healing our institutions and vice versa. Autistic identities become shaped by colonial narratives about normality, productivity, and self-control. These narratives disconnect people from their instincts and ways of knowing. Decolonizing autistic identities means reclaiming autonomy, intuition, and relational truth. When autism is described through deficit-based terms, it colonizes identity and teaches autistic people to distrust their own ways of being. Changing the language we use changes how autistic people understand themselves and how society understands them. The discordant hypothesis teaches us that human beings originally evolved to be in cooperative, interdependent groups when connection is vital to survival, and it's actually biological because it affects the ways that we develop. When these ecological conditions get broken down through capitalism and its associated conditions, then autistic traits are becoming more visible and more stressed. The ecology of connection and the pathology of power explain how safety, belonging, and co-regulation shape human development. A big part of Autism in America as a book is exploring double standards in American society. And one of these double standards looks at how we interpret and understand trauma and its importance and impact in the body. We tend to explore PTSD as primarily something impacting veterans, the military, and males, when the data and numbers show that PTSD is overwhelmingly something that is impacting women and children in America today, and we're not talking about it. These fragmented environments in our stressful homes, in isolated communities, and in coercive systems all overwhelm the nervous system and disrupt human development. Autism is reflecting the emotional cost of living in fragmented social conditions. Sensory and emotional overwhelm are nervous system responses to instability and not personal flaws. It should be noted that violence is learned. Prevention works when we change the norms, attitudes, and systems that enable it. Abusers and toxic systems only have power because the rest of us have been trained to look away and be silent. It should also be noted that constant adaptation to chaos disrupts learning, communication, and emotional regulation for everyone, not just autistics. Global forces like inequality, climate instability, and political conflict shape children's nervous systems. The same global stressors that destabilize societies also heighten autism rates. Healing must extend beyond individuals to the global systems that shape connection. Autism can emerge through two pathways, either inherited sensitivities or trauma adaptations. Both of these pathways are epigenetic related, and what that means is that genes are triggered like a light switch. They turn on in response to the ecology or the exterior environment. This can either happen in utero when the fetus is developing, or it can happen after birth in response to the stresses in the environment. My research has located specific genes that are responsible for both models and pathways of autism. I developed autistic standpoint theory from my understanding of feminist standpoint theory, which says that those who are least powerful typically have the most to say about those in positions of power because they are reflecting the conditions that are created. My autistic standpoint is basically saying that those who are criticized as having the least amount of social skills actually have the most to say about the social norms in a culture. In this manner, autistic perception is a very powerful standpoint for understanding modern society today. People outside the dominant social norms can see these systemic patterns more clearly, and so we're able to call them out. Autistic lived experience becomes a tool for analyzing social inequality, truth, and emotional attunement and coherence. The discordant hypothesis once again shows us the disconnect between our social norms and the ways that our nervous systems have been wired to attune to each other and connect. Autistic perception offers a unique and necessary understanding of this. Because people at the margins see our systems more clearly than those centered in them, autistic lived experience then becomes a tool for analyzing oppression, power, and lived truth. Due to the CDC and the American government currently questioning autism, I'm calling for the autistic community to adopt autistic standpoint theory because it centers our voices in shaping our knowledge, the ethics, and the progress of our community. My book develops several theories that I've tested on myself and my family. Mirror integration theory shows that individuals and societies reflect each other. Personal fragmentation in individuals, families, and communities are all mirroring social fragmentation on a much broader scale. And healing at one level can support healing at another. Autism sits at this intersection and reveals where integration is needed. Colonialism and capitalism rely on conflict and competition in order to function. But conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. Generally speaking, it's just a signal and a sign that something needs to be addressed or given attention. Unfortunately, we're taught to suppress things and not how to deal with them directly. When we approach our problems with more emotional intelligence and resilience, conflict strengthens our relationships and systems. It's not inherently destructive, it's just information. When we embrace it with awareness, it becomes a mechanism for healing. Autistic distress often signals where systems are failing, coercive, or out of alignment. I need to be completely open and honest and forthcoming about where I was at when I wrote this book. I wrote this book while I was actively recovering from PTSD, and as such, it might be a little bit biased in regards to survivorship. It also might be a little bit disorganized, and sometimes it repeats itself. But overall, this book has a lot of cultural and political significance. The information contained in this book is not just theoretical, it also includes practical, applied, and embodied theory through myself and my son. Because before I wrote about them, I first had to develop them and used them myself and then applied them in my parenting. In a very short amount of time, I've seen a massive amount of growth in my kids, and the numbers don't lie. 329% of average typical academic growth in 1 year, 128% personal progress, which is more than double the expected individual development rate. And when I first got custody of my kiddos, there was a 66% approximate reduction in destructive behaviors within the first 90 days. These are all measurements taken from our therapeutic team. In addition to my son's success, there's also my own. Initially, in my early 20s, I dropped out of college 4 separate times. I attended 3 different colleges at 4 separate occasions and was unable to make it happen. However, since 3 years ago, I've returned to college after almost 2 decades and I've attained incredible success. I've gotten numerous scholarships. I have a fairly high GPA and I've been doing very well. This embodied theory is again a testament to how well my ideas actually work in practice. Just as a quick review over the biology portion, if you recall the bold and underlined inflammatory common denominator, here you can see how that actually works. We have the flow chart with colonization and capitalism going down, creating that trauma and that inflammation. That inflammation is then carried systemically down into our collective nervous system. It affects our DNA, our epigenetics. It then affects our biology, our synapses, and that is the entire picture of autism in a nutshell. It's a relational and cultural signal. It's also essentially an allergy to the social ecology and relational conditions in America. Autism tells us about the health of our society, and healing autism requires healing all of our systems, our relationships, and the social narratives we hold about difference. The future of autism is then tied to the future of our collective healing. In conclusion, autism is a cultural signal, a relational barometer, an ecological indicator, and a social allergy. Healing autism requires healing society, its structures, relationships, and social narratives. The future of autism is the future of collective healing. My book, Autism in America, is available now on Kindle on Amazon. It's available on paperback on Amazon. but it's also available for free on a PDF download at ResearchGate. You can find me on Substack, where I talk about my science-y stuff that I'm learning in school, or you can look at my blog, Spirolateral, which is a more creative imagining of my theory.